the Ahnapee and Western Railway. In part 1, we covered the history of the line from Casco Junction to Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Here in part 2, we will dig deeper into the south half from Casco Junction to Algoma. Part 3 will cover Algoma to Sturgeon Bay. Hello friends, KillerBee here. Today we are going to do the old Ahnapee and Western from Casco Junction up to Algoma. And I've got two distinguished guests with me. I've got Andy Laurent, who knows all about the Ahnapee and Western. I've got Mike Cleary, who when he was smaller helped out here on the Algoma Railroad that operated on the Ahnapee and Western. Did I say that right, Mike?
Yes, you did.
Well, let's get started here. The Kewaunee, Green Bay and Western built from Green Bay to Kewaunee, finishing in 1891. That same year, contractors started clearing and grading the Ahnapee and Western right-of-way between Casco Junction and Ahnapee, now Algoma. The railroad was operational between the two in 1892, with Sturgeon Bay reached in 1894. We will begin at Casco Junction. Once upon a time, you could find it on a map, but no longer. However, the Road Commission still identifies the location. The depot at Casco Junction sat in between the Kewaunee and the Ahnapee lines, and there were at least two over the years. Passenger service ended in 1937, and the depot was demolished around 1940. The GBW began operating the line in 1972, and the Algoma Railroad excursion started up in 1976. Initially, they turned back at Casco, but eventually ran to Casco Junction and returned. By then, two legs of the Y were long gone, so they had to run around their train. A clearing was made along the remaining leg of the Y where the trains would stop and people get off at. The excursion ceased in 1979, and the last revenue freight ran up to Ahnapee and Western in 1986. Although car storage operations on the line continued for a while on the very south end. The car ferry ceased coming to Kewaunee in 1990, but there was still some local business there, and the last train through Casco Junction on the Kewaunee line would be in 1998.
All right, we are at Casco Junction, Wisconsin, Sunset Lane. So this is where the Ahnapee and Western from Algoma came in around this curve and met the Green Bay and Western from Kewaunee this way. So there were a set of crossovers right here where they connected, and then the junction itself went all the way down that way. Ahnapee Main on this side, Green Bay and Western Main on this side. They met together again about half mile down. The depot for Casco Junction was a little farther than where that porta-john is. There was a little depot that burned down in the 40s, and there was a turntable pit. There was actually one down there. There was a turntable right here when the railroad was originally built, a ground level gallows turntable. But they built the second one down there. There was a scale house, there was a pump house with a water tower that we'll see. But yeah, this was just a very rural place where the Ahnapee Western and the Green Bay and Western met. And this was the turnaround for the Algoma Railroad.
Right. It was just wide open, and you could hear the GBW listening to that crossing we just came across. And there was another crossing out here someplace.
Yeah.
And on 3 different occasions, we'd be here. Boat train had come through, screaming away with the alcohols on the point. It was pretty cool. I think it was a 40-mile-an-hour railroad. That was pretty neat.
Yeah, with potentially 100 cars.
Yeah, with a lot.
Big
Big train. Yeah, exactly. Big train, right? Not just 6-8 cars, but a big long train hustling by at 40. That was. I remember as a little kid, I was impressed when that happened. It didn't happen very often. But sometimes you get lucky.
Yep. This was a place that is now nothing.
We take a walk along the old right-of-way toward Green Bay.
We gotta stop right. So yeah, the depot was at like right here.
And the pump house is up here on the right someplace. Then, right?
It's way down.
Is it?
Right about where the trees stop.
Is that right? Okay.
I think it'll be that far. Yeah, the scale house. The scale was like right here somewhere. But it's kind of where this necks down, because there's a little ridge. There's a little ridge right there. So there was a scale at Casco Junction, and the scale, concrete scale pit is still there right in this woods. and there was a turntable, and where it went into the hillside, it was a really low foundation, like maybe a 3-foot circular concrete foundation, and that was taken out in, I want to say, the 20s. And the scale house oddly was built like right in the radius of where the turntable had been. So here you would have had the scale house, the runaround, the Ahnapee main, and then about a, I don't know, maybe 30-foot gap, and then the GBW main was here.
Oh yeah, huh? Look at that.
So there was a KGB&W milepost out here, and I posted a picture of it to an email list, and somebody came out here and cut it down.
Really?
There's your pump out. So yeah, the water tank was right here.
The water tank was featured on the cover of the November 1940 Trains magazine, the very first issue. And here we see it in the right background, about 1948. You know, we can't see diddly. Let's come back when the leaves are off the trees. Ah, much better.
How many employees did the Ahnapee and Western have in its heyday?
Heyday, probably 40.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they had truckers. They had probably 10 clerks in the depot in Sturgeon Bay. You had 3 or 4 agents plus assistants. Train crew was always 5 people, sometimes a spare or 2. And then you had the whole traffic department, which was and the corporate people. So yeah, I would maybe 30. I guess.
Mechanical people, track people.
So Eddie Tomjanovich was their only mechanical guy. When they had steam engines, they would hire GBW guys to moonlight on the weekends. So the guys from the GBW would come out on a Saturday to do steam engine work for the Ahnapee. And they always had 2 steam engines because one was in service and one was being worked on. And they would alternate by months. So they'd run one engine for a calendar month, and they'd run another engine for a month. So I've got the employee books that show that, which engine was used every day.
If you look close, random ties can still be found, as can some rail. If you walk along the old GBW right-of-way toward Kewaunee, you will first pass some rails sticking up out of the ground. A little further along, traces of the old Y appear. It's right-of-way and a tie pile. After Vern Bushman purchased the line in 1947 and operations were severed from the Kewaunee line, a Y was built in order to turn the engines as the turntable was gone. We head out along the Ahnapee right-of-way toward Algoma and pause at the location of the Y switch.
This curves around and the GBW tie-in where this road goes. Yeah. And so that Y that we were looking at is right here. The other leg of the Y.
Right.
Is like, this is where it went out.
Yeah, so that's the northeast leg of the Y. Right there.
Correct, yeah, the north, yeah. Here, this is it right here. And this was all mowed. And you could, when the train stopped, you could walk the Y and then come back to the train. Like, I think we stopped for 15 or 20 minutes. He put gravel at the west end.
Okay.
So that was all open.
Alas, all this is just a memory now. Just around the curve from Casco Junction was the Casco Gravel Company, who was in operation from about 1918 into the 1940s. It reportedly had about a mile of 36-inch narrow-gauge track used to bring rock from the quarry to the crushers and operated with a little gasoline engine. For all the infrastructure that once existed, you would never know it today. Here is the view from Sunset Road on the east side of the right-of-way. The railroad was up on the hillside. On the west side of the alignment, there are still a few structures, the end of a road, and what could pass for the grading for a track, maybe. On the east side of the railroad right-of-way is the grade of a gravel pit track, seen in the 1950s and today. Some more rail and ties. The railroad sourced gravel out of here for the track. The right-of-way is quite scenic here. Sometimes the right-of-way is in a cut, sometimes it is on a fill, and sometimes it is cut into a slope. Shortly we come to the Kewaunee River Bridge. Originally it was a 1,300-foot-long trestle, but eventually the approaches were filled in, leaving a 50-foot span supported by stone abutments. High river flows from a heavy rain in March of 1986 started undercutting the south abutment and weakened the bridge. Traffic levels were low and trains sporadic by then. The railroad decided to cease operations over the bridge and on March 27th issued instructions on how traffic for the line would be handled. Cars of steel for Bay Shipbuilding at Sturgeon Bay that had been transloaded at Algoma would now go to Kewaunee. Algoma hardwoods traffic would be transloaded in Green Bay. Controversy and conspiracy theories would soon surround this shutdown, which we will cover later. High waters washed the bridge out completely in June of 1990. The current bridge for the trail is still lacking the south abutment. Winter was also an issue on the south end of the railroad. Cuts would fill in with snow. This train was stranded for 2 days. In this area, blueberry picking was good. Mike reminisces about his uncle, Clint Jones, who, when he operated the Algoma Railroad passenger excursions, would drive his VW camper bus down the tracks on the rails to get to the patches.
So as you know, Clint he loved to pick berries. And he had an affinity for VW camper buses, and he had one, and he learned that the gauge of the camper bus worked just about perfect at 4 feet 8.5 inches, just a little wider than that. And so we would go down to Rockledge Road, put the camper bus on the rail at the air of the tires, and he wouldn't steer. He'd just drive down the tracks, and the camper bus tracked perfectly with the rails, and you just go right to your spot and stop and get out and pick berries and get back in and keep driving up to that crossing that was down by the quarry, down by Casco Junction.
2.5 miles from Casco Junction, we come to Casco, where the population level seems to be in doubt. A building reportedly constructed in 1894 called the Brick Block, or Decker Building, eventually housed the railroad depot along with the post office and bank, as seen on this 1912 map. In 1915, or 1917, depending on the source you reference, it became a mill, eventually becoming Hahnemann Milling Company. It would burn down in 1993, and the site left vacant. Looking south down what is now Church Avenue in a 1912 view, we see the brick block on the left. When it became a mill, the depot relocated to the site across the street on the right. Here we see it in 1961.
So Casco, Wisconsin. We're on the west side of town now. So originally the depot, Ahnapee and Western's depot, would have been right here. Right across the street would have been Hahnemann Milling, which was built by Edward Decker, the person who founded Casco, originally owned the Ahnapee and Western Railroad. He ran magazines out of there, newspapers. Eventually they turned it into a grain elevator, burned down in the early 90s. And across the street was, or across the tracks was Kewaunee County Farm Co. Cooperative, became FS, now is Frank's. These buildings were added in the 60s, feed mills. Actually, the concrete right there was the dump pit where their spur was. So there was a dump pit there that went in and up a leg. The railroad had what was called equity tracks. So the railroad would build these tracks on speculation that small businesses would come, people who couldn't afford to build their own spurs. So they build these equity tracks, and that's where you'd end up with all these little, a lumber yard and a fuel oil dealer and a feed mill, because the railroad had already built them their track. And this was back in the teens, you know, the 1920s, 19-teens. The county had an asphalt delivery where they would bring in asphalt by tank car. Then my grandfather's business, Lawrence Oil, which was a mobile dealer. And then Farrell Lumber was just behind that. And then actually there was a Sinclair dealer that was just a little farther down. So they had a huge derailment. If you look right down there where that sign is, there's the little bridge where Casco Creek goes under. They had a huge derailment right there where they put, I don't know, maybe 8 cars
There's
into
the
it.
tank cars were on that. I remember seeing pictures of that from back in the day.
Big Northwestern steam crane down there. It's in the winter. And apparently caused by a slack action.
That was in January of 1959. In July, there would be another wreck, also between Casco and Casco Junction. We will make a stroll down memory lane again. Move about 1,500 feet over to the east side of town, where the track crossed Highway 54. At one time, the highway crossed the railroad on an elevated crossing. Unless you knew that, though, you would never know it today. It was condemned and in 1979 raised by being dynamited. The facility here has been the Casco Cheese Company, Van Camp's, a lake-to-lake cooperative, Land O'Lakes, and then was purchased by Hanman Milling Company in 1984.
So back in the early 1900s, there was a company right here. We're on the east side of Casco, where the overhead bridge was, but before it was built, there was a company called the Cannon Toy Company, and they made children's toys like croquet sets. They might have made Lincoln Log type things, but that factory was literally sitting right there, and there was a spur that came off the railroad. And for years, my grandmother would talk about they would go up into that old factory site and find things because the factory had burned down and there would still be old pieces of toys and things like that in there. And yeah, that was right there on the east side. And then the big Casco overhead bridge, which was a Depression era WPA project, was right here. So big bridge over the top, torn down. Actually, they dynamited it. Yeah, the tracks, the main line curve
Right here. There's the track.
Yeah, the switch for this spur was back there by that stop sign, and it came in, and it originally stubbed, but then they built it through and connected just on the other side of that grade crossing. And about where those shrubs are, there were 2 loading docks for loading cheese outbound. So most of the cheese was stored. There was a huge basement warehouse with a little conveyor, and there was a tiny little door where that conveyor came out, and they would just sit there and load that cheese right into the refrigerator cart.
And in the first year of operation, this is where they'd stop.
Yeah.
The train stopped here, right? And then they let everybody off to walk around and check out the locomotive, whatever, you know, talk with Clint. And then everybody got back on, they'd run around, and they'd go back from here.
All right.
And
so they didn't even go downtown?
Later on, they did.
Okay.
But I remember doing both. I'm not sure why they picked here or there, but there were trips we made where we'd go downtown, too. And then run around there. Yep. And then like a couple trips they ran at night once in a while for like a birthday event or something where you ate at Moxie's. They went downtown, obviously, because that's where you walked up the hills. Come on.
Very cool. This building was originally built by Evangeline Milk, Van Camp's, as a milk receiving station. So farmers would bring their milk here by truck or wagon, and they would just dump it into vats, and then there were railroad cars. The GBW had flat cars with 2 tanks on them that were permanent. And they would just fill those tanks up and bring them up to Sturgeon Bay every day. So every day, Load in, empty out. and they would drop the cars in, then it would go up to Evangeline Milk, to the cheese factory. Both this company and that one were owned by a company called First National Stores in Boston, Massachusetts. So all this milk made cheese that went to First National Stores in Boston, Massachusetts, and they sold it as under Finest brand. So right after World War II, they expanded this from just a milk receiving station into a cheese factory. So there was a cheese factory here and an evaporated milk plant in Sturgeon Bay, and all of those products went to First National Stores in Boston. And that was until Lake to Lake bought them out in the late 60s, probably early 70s.
So there was a rail spur back here.
Yeah, on the other side.
Oh,
so this side was where the trucks would drive in, and they would drop their, the milk tanks, and they would drop them in, they'd take them in, sample them, dump them out, go through a steam cleaner, and they'd come out a conveyor belt, and they'd all be waiting for you. So you dump back there, and then by the time you pulled up, all your milk cans were empty and steam cleaned and ready for you to take home.
Behind the facility, Casco Creek is dammed, creating the Casco Mill Pond.
The cheese factory was behind us where the feed mill is now. So they dammed this, what my dad always called it was a condensery pond. So one, it was water for the condensers, but two, they also then deposited their whey and their byproducts into the creek. So yeah, this little slipway dam. You're on Casco Creek, which goes into the Kewaunee River right next to the Ahnapee and Western Railroad Bridge that eventually failed.
A couple last sights of Casco: the fountain, at which people will come and fill up their water jugs, and this Miller Genuine Draft tank on wheels, which was pretty impressive. 5 miles by rail is Rio Creek, or, if you are from around here, Rio Creek. It isn't much, but it did have a rail-served industry. Downtown is actually a short ways east on County K, but it is really just an intersection.
So beautiful Rio Creek, Wisconsin. So the main line from Algoma is coming this way. There was a depot and a stock pen and some other things there that got taken out in World War II. Van Dam had a feed mill here that was wood, burned down in the late 40s. This was the replacement, now Rio Creek Feed Mill. It was built in like 1948, was a railroad customer. And then back here was originally a company called Raton's Furniture, R-A-T-O-N. My grandmother worked there in the 30s. And they made church furniture also, like Ahnapee Seating and Veneer did. They made church pews. They went out of business in the 40s, and a company called Walters Farm Equipment bought the building and sold used and new agricultural implements. They got a spur in the 60s, maybe late 50s. So they were a railroad customer as well. And that was really it for Rio Creek. So the original town was where the creek crosses the road. This is actually where the Lawrence, my family, came from. But the original town was down there. When the railroad came through, then the commercial development happened down here. So you kind of had a town with two parts.
A longtime fixture in downtown Rio Creek is Moe's Corner, and on Wednesday evenings they are renowned for their chicken dinner. Order at the bar and eat in the dining room. Good stuff. Next stop for us, Algoma. The railroad reached here in 1892 when it was still called Ahnapee, and a small depot building was erected near the foot of 3rd Street. In 1895, a new depot opened near the foot of South Water Street and Steele. Passengers and freight could transfer to the boats. This was replaced with a third depot, which opened in late 1917, just west of 4th Street. About 500 cars of ballast were dumped as fill to raise the land up. It was torn down in 1980 after the railroad moved to an office a few blocks away in town at 207 Steele Street. This location was used until 1983 when functions were moved to Green Bay and consolidated with the Green Bay and Western staff there. Also in 1983, the railroad sold to the city the right-of-way that ran east from 4th Street along the river. The Y was built in 1906. Facilities for the steam engines were no longer needed after diesels were purchased in 1953. An engine house was constructed in Algoma across from the depot. It still exists today, turned 90 degrees. In 1969, the line north of Algoma to Sturgeon Bay was removed. Piggyback was tried in 1971, but the transit time was too slow versus trucking to the Milwaukee Road ramp at Green Bay. The tracks between Algoma and Casco Junction were taken out of service in 1986 and removed in 1995. Controversy always seemed to swirl around the Ahnapee. The unions had a conundrum in 1971. A full crew law in Wisconsin required an engineer, fireman, conductor, and 2 brakemen on a train. In 1961, the state assembly voted down a bill 46-45 that would have allowed the Ahnapee an exemption from the full crew law. But in 1967, a Dane County judge ruled that part of the law was unconstitutional, and the A&W was the first to apply to the State Public Service Commission for a crew reduction. The commission, under state law, had jurisdiction over the number of employees required on a train for switching purposes. So the A&W had been operating with an engineer, a conductor, and a brakeman, but only operating about 3 times a week. The unions were pressing for full-time employment. The new owners, McLeod River, wanted to continue with 3 men and would guarantee a 40-hour work week. The Trainmen's Union, the United Transportation Union, would not agree to negotiate an agreement for less than what the law required, but they wanted the full employment. 2 things soon resolved the issue: the full crew law being repealed and the GB&W taking over the line's operation. Paralleling the history of the railroad in Algoma was the plywood plant, which also saw its start in 1892 as the Ahnapee Veneer and Seating Company. It went through growth and several name changes and was purchased in 1940 by United States Plywood Corporation, becoming its Algoma division. U.S. Plywood merged with Champion Papers in 1967, changed its name to Champion International in 1972, and closed the plant in 1976. It reopened in 1977 under local ownership as Algoma Hardwoods, was purchased by Masonite, and lasted until 2017. Looking at some aerials, here is a 1946 shot. Out of range at the bottom would be the Y west of town. Here is Plummer's Woodwork. Across Silver Creek is the plywood plant. You can just make out the depot near 4th Street. Then the track ran along the river out to the lake. Another image. The bottom is the east side of the Hardwoods facility, and at the very top is the edge of the depot and freight dock. And moving toward the lake, along the river, is the right-of-way out to the lake. Today one can see a building at a funny angle. It was apparently built when the spur that went down to the packing company and elevator was in place. Let's see what Andy and Mike have to say, starting along the river.
So this was a fish house. So the commercial perch fishing in Algoma, the boats would pull in on the river, which is right down there, load fish into this building, into this warehouse, and that was a narrow door to load fish out by a refrigerator car. And they were shipping fish as late as the 40s. And then behind us was the co-op. So that was a grain elevator and feed mill. They would bring grain both in and out, but mostly it was inbound to go into feed products. So, and then Algoma Net Company was the gray building down there, and they made, originally it was fly nets for horses, but it became hammocks, outdoor furniture, things like that. So they would get steel in and canvas sometimes. So, and then Algoma, the plywood plant is way in the distance.
Yep, so we're looking down the railroad right-of-way
Yep.
here.
Yeah, this was, they called it the alley. Yep. It's got flanges in it.
You calling that what? Trolley rail?
Yeah. So it would have been in the pavers in the street because it's got the flange built in, flange way built in.
But that's,
Yep. So this was the.
I think that's just for the crossing. It doesn't go any further than here, right? And so what that was, you took a piece of this rail and you flipped it on its side, and that kept.
But some of it actually had, like, if you look at the I section, it actually had a little L.
A lip up there.
Yep.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
Because Robo called that trolley rail, and it was in a couple places.
Really?
A few ties can still be found in the ground here too. We relocate over by where the depot had been west of 4th Street.
Depot used to sit right here, right? And then the freight dock, which collapsed in like 77 or 8, was like on the east side, and that's where they used, out of the back side of the depot was where they stored all the equipment for maintenance of the locomotives. The engine house sat here, and there was that crazy tail track that came off right into here. And
So then in the distance, you can see, which was Algoma Cooperatives, that was the feed mill and the grain elevator. There were a couple cheese houses down there. There was a fish house, and then the original depot was on the water. So it was served on one side by boats, the other side by the railroad.
And that's the engine house right there, right?
Yep.
yeah,
it's turned.
It's turned. Yeah, it used to sit with the doors facing the lake, like right there.
We walk east a little ways toward 4th Street. So this is the old right-of-way?
Yep, and the tickets office used to sit right here, the caboose.
Yeah, exactly.
And so Highway 54 is where that red truck is.
Because the caboose sat right up by 54, and there was a sign on it.
Yeah, because the main line kept going, but there weren't any customers on it, so they never went down. And there was the co-op, a couple cheese factories, Algoma Creamery. Van Camp had a peak cannery, which is now the dance hall, where the line went down. There was City of Algoma had a power plant, steam plant down there that they delivered coal cars to. Yeah, this was Farrell Lumber, this with the green roof. They had a lumber yard and a retail. I think by the time you were here, it was probably gone. Lakeview Lumber would have been the big one you guys were probably unloading cars for.
Yeah, not many, but I remember whenever they did it, I don't know where they bring their forklift in, but it got stuck in this gravel.
And then Algoma Foundry was where those gray roofs are. So they made agricultural equipment. So they made like silage blowers, pea hullers. They made
Is that right?
grinders.
I remember the pea thing.
Do you remember? Were they loading out the manure trailer spreaders?
They were.
They did that at those docks.
They still were loading those out.
Yeah. And so that's where they made them, was right there. And their brand was OK brand.
So Mike, clarify. I thought the Algoma Railroad was just an excursion operation, but you made it sound like you moved freight cars around.
Only on Algoma Hardwoods property. And it wasn't like on a regular basis.
Oh, okay.
If they needed help moving cars around, Clint would go in there and fire up their little Plymouth engine and make a couple extra moves for them, and bring cars out for the interchange for the GBW. But we never hauled a single freight car.
Okay, so it's like industrial switching.
Yeah, just industrial. A handful of times, I remember we'd go in there, we'd fire it up on wood and make.
So
make some
what
moves.
did they have for an engine?
It was a little Plymouth.
Yeah,
Wasn't it?
right. Little Plymouth, louder than hell. I remember it was so loud. Yeah, very little.
With a
Plymouth
gasoline engine.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It was a gasoline engine. It was a tiny little thing. But yeah, they'd get, I don't know, I'll say 6-8 cars a week at least.
We head west to the plywood plant complex.
So we were on the main line right here. There was a south pass right here that was literally just a runaround track. North pass was on this side. There were a set of crossovers about where that gravel road is. Then there was a stub that went behind the engine house. Before the engine house was there, that was a team track. So there was a coal yard there, a coke transload, and the depot was down where our cars are standing. And a little stub went into the new warehouse that was built in the mid-50s. And then the main track that went into the plant curved around. And if you look way in the distance, that white door, that's the new door plant. So there was a wood yard out here where there were logs and where they would have lumber out to dry. And the track went in the door plant way in the back. And then up front here, these were warehouses that were built in the late 50s, like 58, 59. This was a 1930s edition. And then the main line went right in front of it, right in front of the plant. But yeah, originally where that says door 4, that was the only truck door in the entire plant.
Is that right?
At one point, that was the truck door. Everything was rail. Wow. I mean, it was logs and lumber in, it was veneer and doors out. So this original Algoma plywood, Ahnapee seating and veneer. So what it was originally called. This is the original plant, and it's wood framed. They added the brick later, but they built this plant because the railroad was coming through here. So the railroad bridge was right there where they crossed Silver Creek. Olsonite was behind it, so they made toilet seats. Originally wood veneer, then they switched to pressed sawdust, in essence. But yeah, front door of the plant. This was the plant originally, and they made depot benches. That's what they started making.
Really?
Depot benches and church pews. Wow. That was the original plant. And it never burned, which for a veneer plant was pretty unusual. But then they added the office, then that was an addition in the teens, I think. And then the warehouse at the end where we looked earlier, that was a 30s edition. Yeah, there were box cars that they'd load right there. Main line was right here. South pass switch came off right here, north pass switch. And then there was a stub in front of the plant. But everybody called it, originally it was just called the plywood. And then when they became Algoma hardwoods, then everybody called it the hardwoods. So like my great uncle was plant manager, John Lawrence.
We continue west over the river to where the Y had been.
This was the oil spur, so there were 4 different oil companies here. Deep Rock, Standard, I can't remember what the other 2 were, but they were just piled in here on top of each other. And the main line went across the road. So Algoma Lumber Company was on the left. They put a spur in there in the 60s. Then the Y split out right behind that gray house, and the line to Sturgeon Bay went to the right. The line to Casco Junction went to the left. Then these buildings were built after the north end was cut off, and they were building the 1,000-foot Lakers at Bay Ship. So all the steel needed to get up there, so they'd bring the steel in gondolas here, unload it on the main. And this was a huge steel yard where they'd put all that plate steel on the ground, and then they truck it up to Sturgeon Bay to Bay Ship. And it's still Frank Stoller today.
And occasionally the cars get spotted, and they would be in various stages of unloading, and we'd have to shove them up the Y and then pull back and then go on our way out to Casco Junction.
Oh, so those cars would be on the main, and you had to get them out of your way
right.
to make the run.
But sometimes they also unloaded them off the Y.
Yep.
I remember them being out of the way on the Y.
Yep.
And then there was a trip we made, and the meat pass planning was very informal. You talk to Jim Roble and you find out where the GBW was and if they were coming down. And I remember one specific trip, we went into the Y, and because the GBW was coming in, it was agreed upon that they were going to do all their work and then take lunch, and then we would continue our way out to Casco Junction and come back, and they wouldn't depart until we got back. So it's like,
I didn't think you guys were ever on the railroad on the same day. That's cool.
I only saw that one time
Yeah.
that I remember. But yeah, so we went on it. So, and I remember Clint saying, you know, the engineer came in and gave a long and a short, and then Clint had to respond with a long. It was like, I don't even remember that signal and whistling, but he told me that they wanted to see if we knew what we were doing, right? Because he signaled a long and a short, and then Clint responded with a long, and that was with the, I guess, in short line days or any days that they used.
Like you see us coming?
Yeah,
I
right,
see
right.
you
And you
coming.
respond, and then, yeah. And so they went by and they did their work, and then we shoved back out. We went to Casco Junction, came back, and they were waiting for us.
Yeah.
We came back in, and then they went on their way back out to Casco Junction. That was the only time I ever remember that happening.
Dan Lidke was a trainman on the Green Bay and Western at Green Bay. He would occasionally be called on to man a train heading up the Ahnapee. He recounts a trip in the winter of 1986, which, unbeknownst to him at the time, would be the second to the last revenue train trip on the line. Plus, a surprise awaited them on this trip.
I got called for an extra job to go from Green Bay to Algoma and back, and it was we still had quite a bit of snow, and so they sent a plow along with us ahead of the engine, and we had about 10 or 12 cars to go up to Algoma with, mostly gondolas and flat cars of steel that were unloaded at Algoma, and the steel was trucked up to Sturgeon Bay for the shipyards. So when we got to Casco Junction, we had to plow ahead the X190, and I think it was the 308 engine, and then we had 10 or 12 cars and a caboose, and we started to plow from Casco Junction going north, and right around on the other side of Casco and just north of Casco, there's a fairly deep cut there, and it was full of snow. No one had gone up to Algoma for a few weeks, and so it had drifted in there pretty good. And so speed limit was only like 10 miles an hour, but so we went into this cut with the plow ahead, and we got about halfway in or a little farther, and we stalled. We couldn't go any farther. So the engineer did some maneuvering, and we backed up, and the roadmaster and the train master was riding in the plow with me, and we got out of the cut. We shoved back out, and then we cut the train off, and then the roadmaster told the engineer that we should go up to speed so we could kind of hit that cut pretty fast, and so the snow would get thrown out of the way. So we just had the engine and the plow, and we went in, hit the snow, and we got kind of bogged down, but we did make it through and came out on the other side then, and then it was back on clear rail, and so then I turned around and we were backing up, and it looked like a tunnel where we had come out of. The snow was piled right up there, but so the roadmaster said, well, it's still pretty close to the track, so we better put the wings out and push the snow back farther. So we made a couple of passes to push the snow farther back from the track, and the snow was right up to the bottom of the window on the engine on the side of the cab. That's how deep it was, and but we made several swipes through there with the plow and pushed the snow back farther. Then we went back and got the train and coupled on the train and started out, and the rest of it was pretty good. We hit a few drifts, but they weren't very bad. But out in the middle of an open field, there was a field crossing there for a farm, and we were going right along about between 10 and 15 miles an hour. And when the plow hit that field crossing, all of a sudden I could feel the plow kind of went up and it derailed. So engineer saw it right away, and he put the train into emergency. But we went a few car lengths because we had these 12 cars of steel behind us, and it was kind of pushing us. So the engine stayed on, but the front truck of the plow came off the rail, and we went a little ways, and then it started to go towards the ditch, and the plow started to lean, and we finally stopped, and I think we had to go out through the front door of the plow because the cab on the spreader had twisted enough that we couldn't get the back door open to get out that way, and so the plow was leaning over pretty far, but it was still coupled to the engine. And we found out that the field crossing that was used for a snowmobile trail, and it was the snowmobiles had packed it full of the mud rails, the guard rails packed full of ice and snow, and it was froze so hard that the snowplow, it wasn't that heavy. And so we had to get the conductor and the brakeman from the rear end walked up from the caboose, and we had to get the railing frogs off of the plow and get them set up on the rail, and then we started to back up and pull the plow kind of back up towards the track. It went back on fairly easy, so we got back on and got everything loaded back up, and then we continued to Algoma and did our work there and ran around our train. We had some cars to bring back, and came back to Casco Junction then and got back on the main line and came back to Green Bay. But we ended up working almost 12 hours. I thought it was going to be an easy job, or a shorter job anyway, but it ended up being a 12-hour job, pretty close. So
The end of the Ahnapee was fast approaching. Another trip was made a week later on March 25th with the Kewaunee Day Train. As mentioned earlier, on the Kewaunee River, high river flows from a heavy rain were undercutting the abutment and weakened the bridge, so 2 days later the railroad decided to cease operations over the bridge. Instructions were issued on how traffic for the line would be transloaded. Controversy soon arose, however. A clandestine bridge inspection declared it usable. The railroad then said the track was bad. Allegations were made the section gang had orders not to perform any track work on the line. On April 16th, a bulletin took all the Ahnapee trackage out of service. But there was one remaining load to go to Algoma, a boxcar of wood flour for plumbers' woodwork. Attempts had been made for 2 weeks to transload it at Green Bay, but were unsuccessful and required specialized equipment. It was decided to handle the car to Algoma, but it was feared the bridge was too weak to support a locomotive. A trackmobile was trucked to Casco Junction, and on April 16th a management crew handled it to Algoma. On April 18th, the empty car and the other remaining empty cars at Algoma, 4 gondolas, were moved off the line. The union complained to the Federal Railroad Administration, alleging an unsafe operation. But what was done was done. The very south end of the line still saw movements from time to time, as AHW boxcars would be stored on the first portion of it. But eventually, the AHW gasped its last. The track was removed in 1995 and eventually became the Ahnapee State Trail. Well, that is the south half of the Ahnapee and Western. I hope you enjoyed our tour. We ended the day at Moxie's in Casco. Mike wanted to have lunch there, so we happily accommodated his request. Part 3 will cover the north end from Algoma up to Sturgeon Bay, with all its associated controversies and stories. To make this video, about 40 sources were contacted for permission to use their images. I thank them all, but also a big thank you to Andy Laurent, Mike Cleary, and Dan Litke. Here you can subscribe and link to other videos. Thank you. Bye for now.